Have you ever met someone who made you feel absolutely everything and completely nothing all at once? One day they're close, the next day they've vanished, cold, distant, impossible to read. You start wondering, do they even care at all? But what if the person who seems the coldest is actually the one feeling things the most intensely, just silently? There's one particular sign, just one, that gives away everything they're desperately trying to hide. Today, you're going to understand avoidant psychology in a way most people never actually do. And once you spot this sign, you'll never look at them the same way again. Most people misread avoidant behavior in the worst possible way. They assume silence means indifference. They assume distance means a lack of caring. They assume that if someone genuinely felt something, they'd express it easily, clearly, consistently. But that assumption falls apart the moment you're dealing with someone who feels deeply, yet fears those very feelings just as intensely. Avoidant people aren't empty inside. More often than not, they're overwhelmed inside. The issue was never that they don't feel anything. It's that what they feel can become too intense, too fast, too unfamiliar for them to actually process. When emotions start rising, especially inside close relationships, something shifts internally for an avoidant person. What feels like genuine connection to you can register as pressure to them. What feels like love to you can feel like losing control to them. They might genuinely enjoy your presence, crave your attention, even think about you constantly. But the moment those feelings start becoming undeniable and real, their instinct isn't to move closer. It's to step back, not because they want to lose you, but because they're desperately trying to regain some sense of emotional balance within themselves. This fear rarely comes out of nowhere. It's usually built over years of learning that vulnerability isn't safe. Maybe their feelings were dismissed in the past. Maybe they were taught to be strong, independent, self-reliant, to the point where needing anyone else started to feel like weakness. So now, when real emotions surface, they simply don't know how to sit with them. They don't know how to express them without feeling completely exposed, and instead of risking that exposure, they shut down entirely. You might notice this playing out in subtle ways. There will be moments they open up, seem warm, present, even affectionate. In those moments, you catch a genuine glimpse of what they actually feel. But then, almost without warning, they retreat. They become distant, harder to reach, less expressive. It can feel confusing, even genuinely painful because it seems so inconsistent. But from their side of things, it isn't inconsistency at all. It's self-protection. They're trying to manage emotions that feel bigger than their capacity to actually handle. Avoidant people often don't even fully understand what they're feeling themselves. They might miss you deeply while convincing themselves they don't need you at all. They might care intensely while struggling to put any of that care into words. There's this constant internal tug-of-war between what they actually feel and what they let themselves show. And that internal conflict produces behavior that looks cold from the outside, but is anything but cold underneath. This is exactly why judging them purely by their actions can be so misleading. Silence isn't always emptiness. Distance isn't always disinterest. Sometimes it's simply the only way they know how to cope with emotions they were never taught how to process. That doesn't make their behavior easy to live with, and it doesn't mean you should disregard your own needs. But it does change how you interpret what you're actually witnessing. Understanding this shifts your entire perspective. Instead of asking, why don't they feel anything? The better question becomes, why do they feel so much that they can't handle it? And that realization changes everything. Because once you see that their struggle is with the sheer intensity of their own emotions, not the absence of them, you start to understand that what looks like a lack of love is often actually a fear of losing themselves inside it. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming distance automatically equals rejection. When someone pulls away, the natural reaction is to take it personally, to assume you did something wrong or that their feelings simply vanished overnight. But with an avoidant person, distance is usually less about you and much more about what's happening internally for them. It isn't always a sign they don't care. In plenty of cases, it's actually a sign that things are starting to feel too real, too close, too emotionally intense for them to comfortably manage. Closeness can trigger a sense of vulnerability in an avoidant person that feels unfamiliar and even genuinely unsafe. The more connected they feel to you, the more they risk getting hurt, misunderstood, or emotionally overwhelmed. So instead of leaning further into that connection, their instinct is to create space instead. That space restores their sense of control. It lets them breathe, think, and settle the internal tension that builds when emotions get too intense. From the outside, it looks like they're pulling away from you, but from where they're standing, it feels like they're just trying to steady themselves. This is exactly why their behavior can seem so confusing. One moment, they're engaged, present, emotionally available in their own particular way. The next moment, they've become distant, slower to respond, or completely silent. It can feel like a switch flipped somewhere, but that switch is usually just their defense system activating. It isn't calculated or manipulative in most cases. It's automatic. They're responding to an internal alarm that says, this is too much, too fast, too close. What makes this even more complicated is that avoidant people rarely explain what's actually happening. They don't usually say, I need space because I'm overwhelmed. Instead, they just create that space without any warning at all. And for the person on the receiving end, that silence can feel exactly like rejection. You're left filling in the gaps yourself, often assuming the absolute worst. But the truth is, their need for distance isn't always a reflection of your value or your importance in their life. It's a reflection of their emotional capacity in that particular moment. The more you chase them when they pull back, the more pressure they feel, and pressure is precisely what they're trying to escape. When someone keeps pushing for answers, reassurance, or closeness while an avoidant person is in that state, it can actually intensify their urge to withdraw even further, not because they don't care, but because they feel like they're losing the very space they need to regulate themselves. This creates a cycle where one person moves closer while the other moves further away, and both people end up feeling completely misunderstood. Understanding this dynamic doesn't mean you should ignore your own feelings or accept behavior that hurts you, but it does help you see that their distance isn't always a deliberate rejection of you. It's often a protective response to something they don't fully know how to handle themselves. They're trying to manage emotions that feel overwhelming, and space is simply the only tool they know how to reach for. Once you start seeing distance as a form of protection rather than rejection, your entire perspective shifts. You stop immediately assuming the worst about yourself, and you start recognizing the pattern for exactly what it is. That awareness gives you real clarity, and clarity gives you actual control over how you respond. Because in situations like this, understanding the why behind someone's behavior doesn't just change how you see them, it changes how you protect your own peace. One of the most confusing and emotionally exhausting experiences is dealing with someone who gets close, makes you feel seen and valued, and then suddenly disappears without any warning. It can feel like emotional whiplash. You start questioning everything: what changed, what you did wrong, whether any of it was even real. But this pattern of getting close and then pulling away isn't random, and it isn't always some kind of game. For an avoidant person, it's usually the result of a deep internal conflict they don't even fully understand themselves. At the core of this behavior sits a push and pull dynamic between two powerful forces: the desire for connection and the fear of it. On one side, they genuinely want closeness. They enjoy your presence, feel real comfort in your attention, and might even imagine a deeper bond forming between you. In those moments, they let themselves move closer. They open up a bit more, communicate more consistently, seem emotionally available in a way that gives you genuine hope. It feels real because in those moments, it actually is real. But as that connection deepens, something else starts rising inside them: fear. Not necessarily fear of you specifically, but fear of what closeness represents to them. It can trigger thoughts of losing their independence, becoming too dependent on someone, or eventually getting hurt. These thoughts don't always surface consciously. Sometimes it just shows up as discomfort, restlessness, or a sudden urge to create distance. And instead of staying present and working through that feeling, their instinct is simply to step back. This is where the disappearance happens. It can be gradual, slower replies, less effort overall, or it can be sudden and complete. To you, it feels like a total shift in energy, like the person you were connecting with simply vanished. But internally, they're trying to resolve a tension they don't know how to handle, wanting you, while also feeling the need to protect themselves from the vulnerability that comes with wanting you. What makes this pattern so difficult is that it creates hope and confusion simultaneously. every time they come close again, it feels like things are finally stabilizing. You start believing that maybe this time will be different, and for a while it might genuinely be. They might show up with more effort, more consistency, more warmth, but unless they've actually addressed the underlying fear, the same cycle tends to repeat itself. The closeness builds, the fear returns, and the distance follows right behind it. It's important to understand this isn't the same thing as someone intentionally playing with your emotions. In many cases, avoidant people aren't even fully aware of the pattern they're creating. They just know that when things get too intense, they feel the need to pull away, and once they've had enough space, the feelings they tried to suppress start creeping back, drawing them toward you again. It's less about control and more about a genuine lack of emotional tools to handle consistency and closeness. For the person on the receiving end, this can be incredibly exhausting. You're constantly adjusting, trying to understand, trying to hold on to the good moments while navigating the painful ones. And over time, it can leave you feeling unstable, like you're perpetually waiting for the next shift. That's exactly why recognizing this pattern matters so much. Because once you see that it's an internal cycle happening within them, not something you personally caused, you can start making more grounded decisions for yourself. Understanding the push and pull doesn't mean accepting it indefinitely. It means seeing it clearly for exactly what it is, a cycle driven by unresolved fear and desire. And when you see it clearly, you stop getting swept up in the emotional highs and lows, and you start deciding what kind of consistency you actually deserve. One of the most frustrating parts of dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies is the silence surrounding what they actually feel. You might be waiting for clear words. I miss you. I care about you. I love you. But those words rarely come easily to them. It isn't always because the feelings aren't there. It's because expressing those feelings directly makes them feel exposed in a way they're simply not used to handling. For them, saying something emotional out loud can feel like surrendering control, and that loss of control is deeply uncomfortable for them. Avoidant people tend to process emotions internally rather than externally. Instead of talking through what they feel, they think about it, analyze it, and often downplay it in their own minds. Even when the feeling is strong, there's a kind of internal filter that stops it from ever being expressed openly. They might want to say something meaningful, but the moment arrives and they hold back, not because they don't care, but because putting emotions into words makes those emotions feel more real, more binding, and harder to escape if things go wrong. Because of this, their feelings often show up in indirect ways instead. You might notice small, subtle actions that don't seem like much on the surface, but carry real meaning underneath. They might check in on you after a long stretch of silence without explaining why. They might remember small details about you that you never expected them to notice. They might help you in practical, tangible ways instead of offering emotional reassurance. These actions can seem inconsistent or confusing if you're expecting clear verbal expression, but for them, this is often the safest way to show they care without fully exposing themselves. The challenge is that these indirect expressions are easy to misread or overlook entirely. When you're used to more direct communication, their silence can feel like emptiness. Their lack of words can feel like a lack of feeling altogether. And over time, that gap between what you need to hear and what they're actually able to say can create real frustration and emotional distance on your end. You might start questioning your importance to them, even if their actions suggest you matter far more than they're willing to openly admit. Another layer to all of this is that avoidant people often struggle to even identify their own emotions clearly. It isn't only about expressing feelings. Sometimes they genuinely don't understand what they're feeling in the moment. They might feel drawn to you, but also uneasy at the exact same time. They might miss you deeply, but convince themselves they're perfectly fine without you. This internal confusion makes it even harder for them to communicate anything clearly because they don't want to say something they're not sure they can actually maintain or fully stand behind. When they do express something emotional, it often comes out in a limited or carefully controlled way. They might downplay it, make it sound casual, or quickly shift the conversation somewhere else afterward. It's their way of testing the waters without diving in too deep. Even small statements from them can carry more weight than they appear to, because they're stepping outside their comfort zone just to say that much in the first place. Understanding this doesn't mean you should settle for a lack of communication. Clear expression is a completely valid need in any relationship, but it does help you see that their silence isn't always indifference. It's often hesitation, uncertainty, and a genuine fear of being too exposed. When you start recognizing the difference between someone who truly doesn't care and someone who simply struggles to express care, you gain real clarity. That clarity lets you respond with awareness instead of assumption. Instead of only focusing on what they're not saying, you begin noticing what they are showing in quieter, more subtle ways. And at the same time, you get to decide how much indirect communication you're actually willing to accept, because understanding someone's limitations doesn't mean ignoring your own needs in the process. There's one particular pattern that stands out above everything else, something that quietly reveals what an avoidant person struggles to admit, even to themselves. It's not found in what they say, because their words are often limited or carefully controlled. It's not even found in how consistent they are, because consistency is exactly what they struggle with the most. The real sign shows up in something much simpler, yet much harder to ignore over time. They keep coming back. No matter how distant they become, no matter how long the silence stretches on, somehow they reappear. It might not always be dramatic. Sometimes it's just a message, a reaction, a small check-in that seems casual on the surface. Other times, it's more direct, like they suddenly want to reconnect, to pick up right where things left off. And each time this happens, it creates confusion. You start wondering why someone who seems so capable of walking away never fully stays gone. The reason this matters is because people who genuinely feel nothing don't feel any pull to return. When someone is truly indifferent, they detach and move on without ever looking back. There's no internal pull dragging them back to the same person over and over again. But with an avoidant person, that pull absolutely exists. They might try to suppress it, distract themselves, or convince themselves they don't need the connection at all. But the feeling doesn't fully disappear. It lingers quietly, building until it eventually brings them back again. What you're actually witnessing in this pattern isn't clarity, it's conflict. Every single time they come back, it's because the part of them that wants connection has resurfaced. The distance never erased their feelings. It only delayed them. When they return, it's usually because they've had enough space to feel safe again, enough distance to lower their defenses. In that moment, the fear grows quieter and the desire to reconnect becomes stronger than the urge to avoid. But this doesn't mean the cycle has actually been resolved. The same fear that made them leave in the first place is still sitting there, just waiting for the next moment of emotional intensity. So when things start feeling close again, the pattern can easily repeat itself. They reconnect, they engage, and for a while, it genuinely feels like progress. Then, slowly, or sometimes suddenly, the distance returns all over again. This repetition can make it genuinely hard to trust their actions because their presence never feels fully stable. It's important to see this clearly without romanticizing it. Yes, coming back can be a sign that they feel something real. It shows the connection matters to them on some level. But it isn't the same thing as readiness. Feeling something and being able to actually sustain it are two very different things. An avoidant person can keep returning without ever fully addressing the fears that keep making them leave in the first place. This is exactly where a lot of people get stuck. They interpret the return as proof that everything will eventually work out, that the feelings are strong enough to overcome all the inconsistency. But without real growth or self-awareness on their end, the cycle tends to just continue. The returns bring hope, but the departures bring the exact same confusion and disappointment right back. Understanding this pattern gives you a different kind of clarity. Instead of only focusing on the fact that they keep coming back, you start asking deeper questions. Are they returning with more consistency, more effort, more openness than before? Or are they simply repeating the same behavior with no real change at all? Because the presence of feeling isn't the same thing as the presence of stability. When you recognize that coming back is a sign of emotion, but not necessarily a sign of readiness, you start seeing the whole situation far more realistically. You stop measuring their care only by whether they return, and you start measuring it by their actual ability to stay, to communicate, and to grow. And that shift in perspective protects you from getting trapped in a cycle that feels meaningful but never actually moves forward. At some point, the focus has to shift away from trying to figure them out and back toward protecting your own emotional well-being. It's easy to get pulled into analyzing every single action, every delay, every moment of distance, especially when you know there's something real underneath their behavior. You start thinking that if you just understand them a little better, respond a little more carefully, or show up in exactly the right way, things will finally stabilize. But the truth is, no amount of chasing can create security with someone who isn't yet able to offer it themselves. Chasing usually comes from a place of anxiety and urgency. When they pull away, you feel this need to close the gap, to restore the connection, to get some kind of reassurance that everything is still there. You might reach out more, try harder, become more available, or even ignore your own discomfort just to keep things from slipping further away. But to an avoidant person, that increased effort can feel like pressure, and pressure is exactly what triggers their instinct to create even more distance. So the more you chase, the more they retreat, and the whole cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Understanding this dynamic changes how you respond. Instead of reacting immediately to their distance, you start to pause. You give space, not as some strategy to win them back, but as a way to maintain your own balance. You stop trying to force clarity out of someone who isn't ready to give it, and you start paying attention to what their actions consistently show you over time instead. This doesn't mean becoming cold or indifferent yourself. It means becoming grounded, aware, and less reactive to every single shift in their behavior. There's a real difference between understanding someone and overextending yourself for them. Understanding lets you see why they behave the way they do. It gives you context so you don't automatically blame yourself or take everything personally. But overextending happens when you use that same understanding to justify staying in a situation that consistently leaves you confused, anxious, or unfulfilled. Just because you can explain their behavior doesn't mean you have to accept it at the cost of your own peace. Your real power comes from recognizing what you actually need and being honest with yourself about whether it's being met. If you need consistency, communication, and genuine emotional presence, those are entirely valid needs. They aren't too much, and they aren't unreasonable. An avoidant person might struggle to meet those needs, and that's something worth acknowledging, but it isn't something you can fix for them. Growth has to come from their own self-awareness and their own willingness to change, not from your effort to constantly accommodate every gap they leave behind. When you stop chasing, something important happens. You create space, not just for them, but for yourself. Space to think clearly, to observe without getting pulled into every emotional high and low, and to decide what you're genuinely willing to accept going forward. You start seeing patterns more objectively, instead of getting swept up in temporary moments of closeness or distance, and that clarity lets you make decisions from a place of real strength rather than pure reaction. This doesn't guarantee they'll suddenly change or meet you where you are. In some cases, they might respond positively to the reduced pressure. In others, they might simply continue their pattern regardless of anything you do. But the goal was never to control their behavior. It's to regain control of your own. Because real security doesn't come from clinging to someone who's inconsistent. It comes from knowing you won't abandon yourself in the process. In the end, understanding gives you awareness. But self-respect gives you direction. You can care about someone, recognize their struggles, and still choose not to lose yourself trying to make something work that simply isn't stable. And that's where your real power lies, not in chasing clarity from someone else, but in creating that clarity within yourself.